All right, good afternoon, everyone. I think everybody knows me. I'm Wayne Motts. It's my honor and privilege to be the Chief Executive Officer here at the National Civil War Museum, and we thank you for spending part of your Saturday afternoon with us here at the National Civil War Museum for our 9th Lessons in History talk for the year. We've got a real treat here for you today. And we also want to acknowledge our partners at the Harrisburg Civil War Roundtable. Several of the members are in the room. And this year, 3 of our speakers here at the National Civil War Museum are also giving talks at the Harrisburg Civil War Roundtable. So our speaker Friday night was in front of everyone at the roundtable, and I understand they put you in front of a square table until like 10:30 at night. We're not going to do that here to you, so good for them. And then our program for October and November, where also those speakers will be speaking at the roundtable and then over here. And what you all need to know is those are 2 different talks. So the roundtable is open, and then over here is open. So 2 different lectures, both of those. Well, it's my distinct privilege to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Lorien Foote. This is her book, The Yankee Plague, Escaped Union Prisoners in the Collapse of the Confederacy. 1 of 4 of her books, I should say. And this is what she's going to be speaking about today. Let me tell you a little bit about her. She's a professor of history at Texas A&M University. And she is going to speak about 3,000 Union prisoners escaped from Confederate prisons in the Carolinas and fled north toward Union lines. She's the author of 4 books on the American Civil War and numerous articles and essays. Her digital humanities project was mapping the escape of the movement of these 3,000 federal prisoners, and that can actually be explored online. So go to eHistory, type in 3,000 escaped prisoners, right, and you'll find that. And she is the co-editor, along with Dr. Earl J. Hess, of the forthcoming Oxford Handbook of the Civil War. And Dr. Earl Hess will be in this room for next month's lecture on October 19th. So you can come back and see both halves of this presentation. We're just really honored that she has ventured all the way up from Texas to be with us today, and we're so happy she's here. Without any further ado, Dr. Lorien Foote.
Good afternoon. It's such a privilege to be here in this wonderful museum. I had not been here before, and I've had a wonderful morning exploring the collections. It's really an amazing site that you have here. Just really a treasure, and I'm just really thrilled to be here. At Texas A&M University, we begin all of our talks by saying howdy. And everybody, all the students yell howdy back. And usually because our classes are so huge, there's 300 of them, so it's really kind of intimidating. But so I will say howdy, but I won't expect you to say howdy back. We'll do it that way. So in the fall of 1864, people in the Carolinas experienced an event that they likened to a plague. I'm going to quote one South Carolina newspaper. "They seem to be everywhere. They actually cover the land like the locusts of Egypt." And the newspaper was referring to thousands of Yankees who were sneaking through the South Carolina countryside under cover of night. And they would just accost unsuspecting black and white Southerners. 2 slaves woke up in their cabin to find Yankees hovering over them demanding food. A woman who was taking a walk with her dog encountered a Yankee sneaking through the woods behind her property. A pastor who was walking through his farm encountered 2 Yankees napping under some fodder, and they woke up and attacked him. And he managed to subdue one of them, but the other one was whacking on him until a neighbor came up and helped him subdue these 2 Yankees. Who were these guys? They were not Union soldiers marching with Sherman's army. They were unarmed, ravenously hungry, escaped prisoners of war. And there were more than 3,000 of them on the loose in the Carolinas in the last winter of the war. So why were there so many escaped prisoners running around? How did this happen? So the story begins when William Tecumseh Sherman captures Atlanta. When he did that, the Confederacy had many of its prisoners of war in 2 locations in Georgia, the notorious Andersonville for enlisted soldiers, and then Macon, Georgia, which is where officer prisoners were. Well, the Confederacy wanted to get these Union prisoners out of Georgia because they don't want Sherman's armies to eventually be able to liberate these prisoners. So the Confederacy is going to move these POWs into the Carolinas. But the problem is, nobody is in charge. So at this point, the Confederacy is really struggling with a command and control problem in this region of the Confederacy. They have two generals who are in charge of their prison system. They have divided responsibility between these two generals, and what's interesting is when I read their correspondence, neither of these guys knew what they were in charge of and what the other guy was in charge of. Okay? They're also unclear who's in charge of some of the Confederate military departments. So what ends up happening is one of the Confederate generals in charge of the prison system, John Winder, he just makes a decision to evacuate Andersonville, evacuate Macon, and to send the prisoners to Savannah and Charleston. But the problem is, with this broken command structure, no one notified the Confederate commanders in charge at Savannah and Charleston that any prisoners of war were coming. So from their perspective, they have an aide who runs in and says, "There's a train coming with 10,000 POWs on it. What are we supposed to do?" Okay? So it's absolute chaos. Major General Samuel Jones is the Confederate commander at Charleston in charge of the Department of South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. He received about 24 hours notice that 10,000 federal POWs were descending on his city at a time that he was still dealing with active and ongoing Union military operations. So these federal prisoners show up. He puts them in the race course at Charleston, and he puts the officers in the jail. They kind of have to go out into the,
Sorry about that.
Oh.
Amazon settings. You can't get rid of Amazon even when you want to. You know? Sorry about that.
That's okay. So the officers get turned out into the Charleston prison. But as all this happens, a yellow fever outbreak happens in Charleston. So Jones just says that's it. And he sends 10,000 of the Union enlisted prisoners of war out of the city of Charleston and sends them north to a little community called Florence, South Carolina. There is no prison or stockade there, and there's only about 125 guards. So these men who are veterans of a summer at Andersonville, they are going to mutiny, and before a stockade can be constructed. They will overpower the guards, they will attack the railroad lines, and they will disappear into the countryside. So basically what happens is Jones has to send troops up from Charleston to Florence. These troops cooperate with just ordinary citizens living in 3 counties around the community of Florence, and ordinary people just grabbing whatever weapons they have, whatever weapons they can find. They work with these troops and they round up these escaped prisoners and bring them back to Florence, and the community, just ordinary citizens, help guard them and then help put them in a stockade that is hastily constructed by impressed slave labor in about a 4-day period. And then these prisoners are put into the stockade. But that was the enlisted men. There's also about 1,500 federal officers in Charleston. And so what Jones does with them is he sends them to Columbia, the state capital. And some of these men escape as they're being marched from the Charleston jail and other locations in Charleston to the train station. Others, I'll come back to that in a minute, others jump off the train on the way to Columbia. So if you'll see here, this map is of South Carolina. So the prisoners are brought, some of them go to Savannah, but a bunch of them go to Charleston. They're taken up to Florence. And then the officers are going to be taken by train to Columbia. And then here at Branchville, the train stops for water. So some of the prisoners jump off at Branchville. The rest of them actually get to Columbia, where they are turned out into an open field about 2 miles west of the city with no fence, no housing. They're just turned out into an open field, these 1,400 Union officer prisoners of war. So what's interesting about this is that the Confederate officers on the train had made these Union officers sign paroles not to escape. And because honor is actually still important to gentlemen officers on both sides, there are prisoners who do not escape even though obviously it would have been easy to do so because they had signed a parole, because they didn't realize they were going to be turned out into an open field. But some of the officers hadn't signed a parole. So what's going to happen is, as the Confederate government goes through a very interesting and lengthy correspondence, when officials in Richmond find out that these prisoners of war have been turned out into an open field, there's about 6 weeks of wrangling. Whose fault is it that the prisoners are there? What are we going to do with them now that they're there? Where do we put them? What's going to happen? And during these 6 weeks, over half of the federal officers in Columbia escape from Camp Sorghum. And they're going to go in one of 3 directions. Some of them are going to choose a shorter but potentially more dangerous route. Some of them are going to go from Columbia either using rivers or just moving across the land, and they're going to try to get to the coast because the Union Army occupies islands in the harbor of Charleston. So they're hoping if they can just get to the coast, they can pick up a Union Navy patrol or something and get to the Union positions. Another group of them are going to walk to Knoxville, which the Union Army occupies at this time, and their justification for that, in their mind, is if they can just get to North Carolina, in the western mountains of North Carolina, there's a bunch of Unionists up there, so we can get help from a bunch of white people. And then there's going to be a group of officers who want to try to find Sherman's army in Georgia. And so they're going to travel towards Augusta and try to link up with Sherman's army as it's marching towards Savannah. So you can see these kind of darker gray areas are the travel routes that all of these escaped prisoners from Florence, from Columbia, are going to try to use. Well, what's interesting to me when I look at the story of these Yankees who escaped is that their experience, their journeys, give us insight into what was happening in the Carolinas in the last months of the war as the Confederacy was collapsing. So what I want to do today is talk about 2 aspects of that collapse. We're going to talk about the collapse of slavery, and we're going to talk about the collapse of the home front. And then after we do that, I'm also going to talk about what happened to the prisoners who did not escape. Because those who didn't escape, they're going to end up clogging up military operations for the Confederacy. And so those are kind of the 3 storylines that we're going to follow today. So as these Yankees pour out into the South Carolina countryside, they poured out into a state where slavery was in the process of collapsing. And slavery collapsed at different paces and in different ways in different parts of the state. So in some places, the collapse of slavery in South Carolina was relatively advanced. So in the low country part of South Carolina, near the coast, this region, slaves there had been able to go to the coast, hail Union gunboats or steel boats, and find ways to get to the Union Army across the waters. And so there we find that slavery has been very much disrupted by this point in the war. So this is September, October, November 1864. So slaves in that part of South Carolina had actually organized military companies that were operating against the state, against state troops. We find complete shutdowns of work. We find slave women refusing to obey commands of their mistresses, and slavery was really advanced in its disintegration. But in upper parts of South Carolina in the upper parts of South Carolina in the mountains, Union armies weren't anywhere near there, and slavery was kind of still moving along much as it had before the war. And what we're going to see is that the arrival of these hundreds of Union escaped prisoners moving through upcountry South Carolina is going to change the situation. Because what historians see is that slaves during the Civil War are very wise in assessing the military situation in the given region where they live. They look for signs to see that the situation is favorable for them to take action to secure their freedom. And there haven't been very many good signs for those slaves in upcountry South Carolina until the arrival of these Yankees. So what we see is that when the first escaped prisoners start moving through upcountry South Carolina, at first they get food, guides, assistance from individual slaves. But within the next 2 or 3 weeks, that aid becomes much more organized. So there's an escaped prisoner named Hannibal Johnson, and he escapes a few weeks after he's arrived at Camp Sorghum. And when he starts moving through the countryside, he gets handed off to 8 different guides at prearranged stations. There are stops where he gets food, where he gets assistance, and the stations are, and a guide will take him from one, leave him there, a new guide comes. One of the guides actually has a code name for the escaped Union prisoners that he's helping. He calls them birdies. When Hannibal Johnson gets brought up to this particular guide, he says, here's my birdies for tonight. So the aid is becoming more organized. And we also see slaves in this region organized to help the Yankees against their masters. So outside the community of Jalapa, South Carolina, some of the people in the community knew about these massive escapes. And so what they did was they formed a picket on the main roads leading to their community that they kind of picketed 24 hours a day because they wanted to catch any Yankees that might be trying to come up the road and sneak through the countryside. Well, what slaves in the community did was they formed a counter picket on the road just a little farther south from where the white people in the community were so that they could get the Yankees first and then guide them around the picket that their masters had set. And I think we can see how slaves act to bring about their freedom and, critically, to assist Yankees, which they viewed as a military act, because they knew that assisting escaped prisoners to get back to Union lines, get back to their units to continue the war, was a military act that would hurt the Confederacy. So a lot of the slaves, they make these kind of statements to the escaped prisoners that, we're against the Confederacy, we want to bring it down, we're going to help you to bring it down. And I think we can kind of see this if we look at what happened on the Harris farm. So there was a farm outside of Spartanburg, South Carolina, that was owned by David and Elizabeth Golightly Harris. And up until that point in 1864, their slaves had farmed and worked, and as far as they could tell, behaved normally. Well, in October of 1864, Elizabeth notices, her husband at this point is doing some duty in Charleston, Elizabeth notices that the slaves are not acting quite the same. They're a little bit more defiant. She notices things are missing around the farm. She notices that hogs are being slaughtered and left their carcasses just out around the farm. She suspects that her slaves are doing it, but as she puts in the diary that the family keeps, they won't say anything, and I can't find any men in this town to whip them for me. It seems we're getting afraid of our Negroes. Now, isn't that an interesting thing to say? So she can't get any information, and then she discovers a few weeks later that her slaves have been hiding escaped prisoners in the gin house. That explains the slaughtered hog carcasses. That explains a lot of the defiance. And the slaves refuse to tell her anything about it. She gets some men in the neighborhood and they get some weapons and they try to find where these Yankees have gone and they can't. And then after that incident, 3 or 4 of the slaves slip away. Then another few slip away. And by Christmas, many of the slaves on the plantation were gone. So it's clear that the slaves in the Harris farm, that they recognized what it means that the Confederacy could not hang on to so many Union prisoners, that the time was ripe to act for their freedom. And so they helped these Yankee prisoners, and then they left. So I think this gives us an interesting window into the escalating slave resistance that happened in South Carolina in the waning months of the war. I think that the story of these escaped prisoners also tells us about the collapse of the home front. And we can see that if we look at what happens as prisoners who are moving to Knoxville end up in western North Carolina. So this is kind of a map as the escaped prisoners move with the help of these guides out of South Carolina. They're going to move into the Appalachian region of North Carolina as they're trying to move to Knoxville. And what they find when they get there is they find a region where the home front has collapsed. It's a region where deserters from the Confederate Army are engaged in battle with North Carolina troops that are sent to round them up. It's a region where Unionist guerrillas and Confederate guerrillas are fighting each other. And what's interesting is this fighting draws everyone in the family together into the violence. So there's many aspects of the collapse that I talk about in the book, but for our purposes today, I just want to focus on one aspect, and that's the participation of women and children in facilitating irregular warfare and violence between Unionists and Confederates that's going on in western North Carolina. And these escaped Yankee prisoners get stuck right in the middle of it. So we could take the example of J. Madison Drake. He is a fireman from New Jersey, and he's one of the Yankees who jumped off that train at Branchville when it stopped for water. And his escape party is going to reach the mountains of North Carolina in late October of 1864. And when they're walking down this one kind of ravine, and they see two women and a young boy who are cutting sorghum grass. And so Drake and his escape party go up to this family, and they pretend to be Confederate deserters, because what these escaped prisoners often think is safest is just to try to pass themselves off as deserters, because at this point they're wearing a hodgepodge of weird clothes. Most of them have been in prison for 12, 13 months, so they've traded with their guards for clothes, so they're not necessarily dressed in federal uniform. And one of Drake's escape party was actually a Union officer from Kentucky, so he had somewhat of a southern accent. So they're going to try to pass themselves off as deserters. So they walk up to this woman, and they start into their, we're deserters, we need some help story. And she cuts them off. She goes, I don't believe you. I think you're Yankees. And if you are, I'm happy to help you, because I hate the Confederacy and everything it stands for. Show me proof that you're a Yankee. And so Drake gets out his diary that he's been keeping. He gets out his commission as an officer. And when he does that, this woman whose name turns out to be Mary Estes, she takes a handkerchief out of her pocket and she waves it over her head 3 times. And when she does this, about 47 men in full Confederate uniform with weapons come out of the mountains. They were a group of Confederate deserters. Her husband was one of them. And what Drake finds out as he ends up spending some time with the Estes family is that Mary Estes and her son Joseph are critical to the operations of these Confederate deserters as they fight against the Confederate military in the mountains and as they fight against Confederate loyalists in the region. So Mary Estes provides guide, information, intel. She and other women in her family serve picket duty for these men who are guerrillas. She helps with putting together the ammunition that they need. She's kind of a supply line for these men who are living in the mountains and fighting against the Confederate government. The Confederate government actually, I looked in the North Carolina State Archives at Adjutant General records. I verified everything that the Yankees wrote in their diary. I verified it if I could with other records. Confederate officials tortured her son Joseph, who was 13 years old, to try to get him to give up where his father was. So every member of the family is part of this effort to fight the war in their way in North Carolina. We see the same thing with an escaped prisoner named Charles Porter Maddox. He was an officer from Maine. He escapes from Camp Sorghum. He's going to end up staying with a family in western North Carolina named the Loftus family. And this is a family like so many other families in the region that in their house they've drilled holes in the wall so that when their rebel neighbors come and attack them, the men will put the weapons through these holes in the wall. The women will load and cool off the weapons and then hand them to the men to fire. The young children in the family serve as pickets outside the house. They raid their neighbors, everyone in the family, they raid their rebel neighbors for beef. And so it's a warfare between neighbors that every member of the family participates in that. And Maddox and Drake they're just shocked by what they see, the level of participation, especially by children. So there's a party of Yankees who, I can't even believe this, a party of Yankees that when they get to North Carolina, there's a family that sends their 11-year-old boy alone with 8 escaped Union prisoners overnight for this boy to guide them over to the mountains to the nearest house of a Unionist family. And so just that idea of sending an 11-year-old boy alone at night. But it wasn't just boys. There is a party of escaped prisoners, by this time that's grown to number about 70, that is guided by a 16-year-old teenage girl named Melvina Stevens. So by this time, the Yankees had crossed into eastern Tennessee, and there were a lot of Confederate guerrillas operating in that region. And Melvina Stevens knows the region very well, and she was apparently an expert horsewoman. And Melvina Stevens, on her horse, guided this party of 70 Yankees through where the pickets were for the Confederate guerrillas. And then when they reached this big river, the Nolichucky River, she left this party of men on the side of the mountain, and she rode alone over a bridge. They watched her do it to see if there were any Confederate guerrillas on the other side of the water, and then she came back and told them that it was safe and that they could continue. And when this particular escape party actually included 2 reporters from the New York Tribune, who were very well-known writers in the North, and they both publish accounts, of course, as soon as they get home that they want to make a bunch of money on. And they don't name her, they tell the story, but they call her the Nameless Heroine. And this story kind of takes off in the North, and there's a song written about her. But later in the decade, her name is revealed when people believe that it's safe. So you see in this picture of her, I'm pointing, you see in this picture of her, the Nameless Heroine in quotation marks. That was kind of how she had been known to Northerners because of her action. And so here's a picture that was taken when an escape party reached Knoxville. Often in North Carolina, the fugitives would pick up deserters that wanted to leave the Confederacy and go ahead and go and enlist in the Union Army, changing from the Confederate Army to the Union Army. So this is a party that includes some escaped prisoners, some deserters from the Confederate Army, and their 14-year-old boy guide, who is right here. And this picture's at the Library of Congress. So that's just a little snippet of what happens with the escaped prisoners. But I also want to turn today to talk a little bit about the prisoners who did not escape, the ones who remained in Camp Sorghum, the ones who got put back into that prison pen at Florence. Because what happens to them will also reveal how the collapse of the Confederate prison system contributes to the collapse of the Confederate military defense of the Carolinas in early 1865. So there are still Union officers at Camp Sorghum. By December, the Confederacy decides to move them into the insane asylum in Columbia. If you'll remember, the escaped enlisted men are in Florence. And what happens is, of course, by February of 1865, here comes Sherman again. Now he's marching into South Carolina. So now the Confederacy is once again facing a Union army, and they've got thousands of prisoners in a state that they want to get rid of. Well, the difference this time is by February 1865, the Union and the Confederacy have agreed to an exchange of prisoners. All of the prisoners in that region are going to be exchanged. So the Confederacy said, okay, great, now we can get these prisoners exchanged. The problem was the exchange point that was picked was Wilmington, North Carolina. And Wilmington, North Carolina at that time was undergoing active military operations. The Union had just captured Fort Fisher and was now moving on the city of Wilmington, closing off the last blockade-running port in the Confederacy. So these 2 generals who are combating each other outside of Wilmington, for the Confederacy, Major General Robert F. Hoke, and for the Union, Major General John M. Schofield. So Schofield is moving up the peninsula from Fort Fisher to Wilmington with his army. Hoke is trying to defend the city. Once again, I'm going to sound like a broken record throughout this presentation. Nobody bothered to tell either of these guys that an exchange of prisoners was going to take place at their location. So what happens to Hoke is that he is preparing the defense of the city, and 2,500 Union prisoners of war show up at the train station. And his aides run up to the train. What is this? And they're like, well, this is the first of 10,000 prisoners that we're bringing from South Carolina because there's going to be an exchange. And Hoke is like, what? reading the correspondence about this was really amusing, I have to say. So Hoke sends a message to Schofield, and he says, I've got your prisoners of war, and I want to exchange them. Schofield hasn't heard from his side about any exchange of prisoners, so he doesn't know that maybe this is just a ruse to get me to stop my operations, because so he sends a message back, and he's like, I don't know what you're talking about, and I'm not going to stop my operations. So Hoke says, okay, get the prisoners out of here, send them back. So the initial group of 2,500 that showed up get moved out of the city, and now I have to show a map. So what happens in February of 1865 is, as you can see, here's the prisoners from Florence, here's prisoners from Columbia, Sherman is marching. So the prisoners at Florence, they go up the train to Cheraw, then they have to march by land, because this railroad line has been destroyed between Florence and Wilmington. So they have to go to Cheraw, then they have to march overland to Charlotte, and then take the train like that to get down to Wilmington. The officers at Columbia are taking the train like this. So when Hoke first sends the first group back, what ends up happening is 10,000 prisoners of war just get shuffled back and forth between Goldsboro, Raleigh, Greensboro, Salisbury, and Charlotte. And while this happens, 1,700 of them escape. Now, of course, as the Confederates are trying to defend Wilmington, the fact that you've got 10,000 prisoners of war being moved around on the railroad line is going to disrupt the flow of supplies to Wilmington that are supposed to be used for the defense of Wilmington. But then it's also going to disrupt the evacuation. So once Union armies really the Union Army really starts converging on Wilmington, Hoke is going to try to evacuate the most critical supplies. But he can't do it because the train lines are clogged with all of these prisoners of war that are being moved back and forth. So along the way, the Yankees keep getting turned out into open fields, then loaded back on the trains, moving back and forth, and 1,700 escape. When the initial group that had arrived and then gets sent away, there's a whole group of them that escape there and then just kind of hang out outside of Wilmington. And they find that they're hanging out outside of Wilmington with a lot of slaves from the area around Wilmington who know that the Union Army is about to take the city, and so they have come to Wilmington so that they can get there and be there and get their liberation from slavery. So what happens is a lot of the escaped prisoners, they end up hanging out in the swamps around Wilmington with black men who have also come to the region, and they hang out for days together and they eat. So there's a former Florence prisoner named George Weiser, and he kept a diary that he then later turned into a memoir, and he describes several days of living in a hole in the swamp with two black men, and they swap stories about their experiences during the war. They listen for the sounds. How close is the Union Army to Wilmington? When do we think we can come out of our holes in the swamp? And then one of the black men says, I'm going to go and scope it out because it seems to me the sounds of battle have changed. So he goes towards the city and he comes back and he says, I see a Union flag flying over the city. So they come out of the swamp, and as they move towards the city, they're joined by hundreds of other escaped Yankees, runaway slaves, as they move towards Wilmington. So at this point, Schofield's force captures Wilmington. And by this time, Schofield has gotten a message from Union authorities that says, yes, there really is supposed to be a prisoner exchange. And so Schofield halts active operations. He communicates with Hoke, and they exchange these 10,000 prisoners that have been on the way. But what's interesting to me about this is that, historians don't often consider what the logistics of moving prisoners of war, capturing them, transporting them off the battlefield, how this may have affected campaigns. I mean, when I was doing the research for this book, I looked at some of the famous battle histories that we have of the Civil War. And I would look up prisoner of war in the index. I mean, a lot of them I'd already read. And either prisoners of war wouldn't even be listed, or there would be just a funny anecdote about a prisoner. And I'm thinking, there were 9,000 prisoners captured at this battle. And you're telling me that this isn't worth an investigation of how capturing that many men processing them, moving them off the battlefield might have impacted how this campaign unfolded. So I just have to throw this in because I think this is a real area that we need a lot more investigation of understanding how POWs interacted with military operations. So I had one of my graduate students do something on it, and he discovered that when Grant captures Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, that the 13,000 POWs that he had actually held up his ability to continue offensive operations for 4 days. And Grant actually, in some of his dispatches, he calls it the challenge of victory. POWs were the challenge of victory. And he says, I don't know if I want to do this anymore. I think maybe we should just parole them on the battlefield. And that's what he does at Vicksburg. Anyway, just throwing that out there as a teaser. So when I think about what happened in Carolina and these 3,000 escaped prisoners over the course of a few months, when we think about the end of the Civil War, we think about Appomattox, we think about the surrenders in North Carolina. But I think when we think about the end of the Civil War, we also need to think about the people of the Carolinas and what the last days of the war were like for them. When escaped prisoners showed up at their home, when women and children were aiding in violence, when slaves were asserting their freedom, this is what heralded the last days of the Confederacy, when backyards and barnyards became sites of war. Thank you.